Picture this. You're a caveman. Not the cool Hollywood kind with a full head of hair and a suspiciously symmetrical face. The actual kind. You live in a group of maybe 25 people. Everyone you know, you've known your whole life. There's no Tinder. There's no next village over that you can just casually stroll to because the next village over is either 50 miles away through a forest full of things that want to eat you, or it doesn't exist yet because your species hasn't spread that far. So here's the uncomfortable question that historians, geneticists, and anthropologists have been chewing on for decades. If your dating pool is your immediate family, how did humanity not just collapse into a gene pool the size of a bathtub? Because here's the thing, it didn't collapse. We're here. You're watching this on a device more powerful than the computers that landed people on the moon, which means somewhere back down the line, your ancestors figured out how to keep the gene pool clean enough that you didn't end up with, well, let's just say more chromosomal baggage than usual. And the answer to how they pulled this off is one of the most fascinating detective stories in human history, involving DNA extracted from 50,000-year-old bones. Marriage rules so complicated they make tax law look simple, and at least one Pacific island where things went catastrophically, spectacularly wrong. So let's start at the very beginning, with a group of people who are not actually people yet, at least not us. Let's talk about Neanderthals. For a long time, the working assumption was that Neanderthals lived in small, isolated pockets, hunkered down in their little valleys, doing their own thing, occasionally meeting a human, and giving us a bit of DNA before dying out. Kind of a sad, lonely picture. But then, in 2022, researchers sequenced the genomes of Neanderthals found in a cave system in Russia called Chagirskaya, and what they found flipped the script entirely. These Neanderthals were living in small groups, sure, maybe 10 to 20 individuals, but the genetic evidence showed something remarkable. The women in these groups were not related to the men. They'd come from somewhere else, somewhere far enough away that their genetic signatures were distinct from the local population. In other words, Neanderthals were doing something we don't usually give them credit for. They were running an exchange program. Young women were leaving their birth groups and joining new ones, generation after generation, like a prehistoric conveyor belt specifically designed to stop everyone from being everyone else's cousin. This wasn't an accident. This was a system. And if a species we spent decades stereotyping as slow, brutish, and not particularly bright figured out functional exogamy, the practice of finding partners outside your own group, then clearly this problem and its solution go back a lot further than anyone assumed. Now, let's fast forward to us, Homo sapiens. Modern humans show the exact same pattern. And, honestly, an even more sophisticated version of it. Genetic studies of ancient human remains across Europe, from sites tens of thousands of years old, consistently show something that should seem impossible for tiny, scattered populations. Low levels of inbreeding. Not zero, but far lower than you'd expect from small, isolated bands. Which means somebody, somewhere, was doing math. Not written math, obviously, nobody's carving out a spreadsheet on a cave wall, but a working, practical, socially enforced system of math about who could marry whom. And this is where things get wild, because the solution our ancestors landed on wasn't just go find a stranger and marry them. It was something far more elegant and far weirder called a kinship system. And once you understand how these worked, you will never look at a family tree the same way again. Let's use a real example, because abstract anthropology talk is a great way to lose viewers faster than a mid-roll ad. Let's talk about Australian Aboriginal kinship systems, some of which are still practiced today, and are, frankly, one of the most sophisticated social technologies ever invented by human beings. In many Aboriginal societies, every single person is born into a specific subsection, sometimes called a skin group. There might be 8 of these subsections in a given community. And here's the kicker, your skin group doesn't just tell you your identity, it tells you, with mathematical precision, exactly which skin group you are allowed to marry into. Not people like this or people from that village, but a specific named category that rotates through generations like a genetic Sudoku puzzle. Marry into the wrong subsection. And it's not just frowned upon, it's considered as taboo as marrying your own sibling, even if the person you've chosen is biologically speaking, a total stranger from 300 miles away. Now, here's the part that should blow your mind a little. These systems were so precisely engineered that they functioned as a form of applied genetics thousands of years before anyone knew what a gene was. Anthropologists who've mapped out these subsection systems mathematically have found that they systematically prevent marriage between anyone closer than a certain degree of relatedness, while still keeping the marriage pool wide enough that people had actual choices. It's essentially a social algorithm for genetic diversity, running on culture instead of code, and it worked so well it's still in use in the 21st century. Compare that to what we tend to picture when we think about cavemen problems, and it's almost embarrassing how much smarter they were about this than the movies give them credit for. But subsection systems are just one flavor. Cultures across the world came up with wildly different, equally clever variations on the same basic problem. Let's talk about the Trobriand Islanders, off the coast of Papua New Guinea, made famous by the anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski in the early 1900s. Trobriand society runs on something called matrilineal descent, meaning your clan identity, your land rights, your whole social position comes from your mother's line, not your father's. And built into that system is a strict rule. You cannot marry or even flirt with anyone from your own clan, no matter how distantly related they technically are. Your clan could include hundreds of people spread across multiple villages who you've never even met, and the rule still applies because the goal isn't just don't marry your actual cousin. The goal is maintain a wide enough boundary that accidental inbreeding basically becomes impossible. Here's the detail that always gets people, though. The Trobriand Islanders, when Malinowski was doing his fieldwork, insisted that pregnancy had nothing to do with sex. They believed spirits entered a woman's body and caused pregnancy, completely independent of biological fatherhood. And yet, and this is the part that should make anthropologists everywhere sit up, despite not having a correct biological theory of conception, they still had an airtight system for preventing inbreeding. Which tells you something important. You don't need to understand genetics to accidentally invent a system that protects genetics. You just need enough generations of trial and error and enough cultural memory of what happens when you get it wrong. And believe me, they knew what happened when you got it wrong. This is where we need to talk about the flip side of this whole story. What happens when a population doesn't have an exit strategy? Because for every clever kinship system, there's a case study of isolation gone wrong. And one of the most famous, most heartbreaking examples is Pitcairn Island. In 1789, after the mutiny on the Bounty, a small group of British sailors and Tahitian men and women settled on Pitcairn, a speck of rock in the middle of the Pacific so remote it wasn't even correctly marked on maps for years. The founding population was tiny, something like 28 people. For decades, that was it. No new arrivals, no departures, just the same handful of families having children who married each other's children because there was, quite literally, nobody else. By the time outside ships started regularly visiting in the 20th century, genetic and health researchers found elevated rates of certain hereditary conditions on the island, a direct fingerprint of generations of unavoidable close relative marriage. Pitcairn is basically a real-world control group showing us exactly what happens when a population lacks the tools, cultural, geographic, or genetic, that our ancestors spent tens of thousands of years developing. The same story, roughly, plays out on Tristan da Cunha, one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth, way out in the South Atlantic. Founded by a tiny number of settlers in the early 1800s, the population there has dealt for generations with a genetic condition called retinitis pigmentosa, a progressive eye disease, at rates far higher than the general population, again because the founding gene pool was so small and so isolated that certain rare genetic mutations kept getting passed down and reinforced instead of getting diluted out. These aren't just sad historical footnotes. They're proof of concept for the entire argument. Small, isolated groups without a system for bringing in new genetic material run into trouble. Which means the fact that most of human history did not look like Pitcairn Island is not an accident. It's the result of active, ongoing cultural effort, stretched across hundreds of thousands of years, by people who had absolutely no idea what a chromosome was. So how did they figure this out without the science? Great question, and the answer is a mix of pattern recognition, superstition, and some brutal trial and error. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the incest taboo itself, because it turns out that don't have kids with your close relatives might be one of the most universal rules in human culture, showing up independently in societies that had zero contact with each other across thousands of years and multiple continents. The French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss spent a huge chunk of his career arguing that the incest taboo isn't really about biology at all, at least not directly. In his view, the real function of the taboo was social. It forces families to marry outward, which forces different groups to form alliances, trade relationships, and mutual obligations. A society where every family is self-contained and never needs anyone else is a society with no reason to cooperate, no reason to avoid conflict, no shared interest in keeping the peace. But a society where you have to send your daughters and sons out to marry into other families? Suddenly everyone's stuck being polite to their in-laws because those in-laws are now your allies, your trading partners, and the people who'll back you up if a rival group decides to start something. In other words, the incest taboo might have started evolutionarily and culturally as a peace treaty disguised as a marriage rule. The genetic benefits, healthier kids, fewer hereditary diseases, may have simply been a happy side effect that got reinforced over time because, well, the groups who accidentally avoided inbreeding also happened to outsurvive and outreproduce the groups who didn't. Natural selection doesn't care why you're doing the right thing, it just rewards you for doing it. And this is really the crux of the whole story. Ancient humans almost certainly did not sit down and think we must preserve genetic diversity to avoid recessive allele expression. They didn't need to. What they needed was some combination of instinct, disgust, superstition, and social pressure that happened to produce the same result. Evolution is extremely good at building shortcuts like this. You don't need to understand germ theory to know that eating rotten meat makes you sick. You just need to evolve a strong disgust reaction to the smell. Same deal here. Groups that developed a strong cultural aversion to close relative pairings, for whatever reason, ended up healthier, more socially connected, and more likely to survive and pass that aversion on to their own kids. There's actually a fascinating psychological theory that helps explain where this disgust comes from on an individual level, called the Westermark effect, named after the Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermark, who proposed it back in 1891. His theory: children who are raised in close proximity during early childhood, especially before around age 6, develop an automatic, subconscious sexual aversion to each other later in life, regardless of whether they're actually biologically related. This isn't just a theory sitting in a dusty old book either. It's been tested in the real world in a fascinating natural experiment involving Israeli kibbutzim, communal farming communities where unrelated children were often raised together in shared children's houses, almost like siblings. Researchers who studied marriage patterns among kibbutz-raised adults found something striking. Even though these children were completely unrelated and free to marry each other, marriages between children who'd been raised together in the same peer group from a young age were exceedingly rare. Not forbidden, not against any written rule. Just nobody wanted to. A similar pattern shows up in a completely different context, a Taiwanese custom called minor marriage, where families would sometimes adopt a baby girl to be raised alongside their son, with the plan being that the two would marry each other once they grew up. Sociologist Arthur Wolf spent years studying the outcomes of these arranged childhood pairings, and the data was almost comically consistent. These marriages had noticeably higher divorce rates, lower birth rates, and more reported extramarital affairs compared to marriages between people who met as adults. Raise 2 kids together from infancy, and by the time they're supposed to fall in love, their brains have already filed each other under family, and you can't just unfile that with a wedding ceremony. This matters for our story because it suggests the incest taboo isn't purely a cultural invention passed down through rules and punishments. There's a psychological mechanism baked into us, built by evolution that does a huge amount of the work automatically, without anyone needing to enforce anything. Which honestly raises the question, which came first? The cultural taboo or the psychological aversion that made the taboo feel so obviously correct that everyone just assumed it had always been a rule? Probably both, feeding into each other over an absolutely enormous span of time. Now let's zoom back out to the scale of entire populations, because there's another layer to this that's honestly one of the coolest parts of the whole story: the sheer scale of ancient human migration and mixing. For most of human history, populations were far more mobile and far more interconnected than the isolated tribe stereotype suggests. Genetic research on ancient European populations has revealed something called patrilocality, combined with female exogamy as an extremely common pattern. Men tended to stay in their birth communities their whole lives, while women were the ones who moved, sometimes surprisingly long distances, to join their husband's community. Studies of Bronze Age burial sites in Germany found that women buried there had distinctly different geographic and genetic origins than the local men, sometimes hailing from hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting a long-distance marriage network stretching across huge portions of ancient Europe. Think about that for a second. We're talking about societies without maps, without writing in most cases, without any of the infrastructure we associate with long-distance travel, and they were still running what amounts to a continent-spanning marital exchange network. Somebody had to walk those women hundreds of kilometers, through unfamiliar territory to unfamiliar people, generation after generation, specifically to keep the gene pool from stagnating. That's not an accident. That's logistics. That's basically the Bronze Age equivalent of international relations. Except the diplomats are also the ones getting married to seal the deal. There's also strong evidence that entire hunter-gatherer band structures were specifically engineered around this problem long before agriculture, long before permanent settlements. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, like the Hadza in Tanzania or various sand groups in southern Africa, whose lifestyles are believed to closely resemble ancient hunting and gathering patterns, show something important. Even though people live in small bands of maybe 20 to 50 individuals, those bands are not isolated. They're part of a much larger network, sometimes involving hundreds or thousands of people spread across many bands who regularly meet, mix, exchange members, and intermarry. Researchers analyzing camp composition in these societies have found band membership is remarkably fluid, with individuals moving between different camps throughout their lives, camps that are frequently made up of a rotating cast of relatives, in-laws, and unrelated new arrivals. This fluidity turns out to be the actual secret weapon. It's not that any single band of 25 people was self-sufficient forever, it's that the boundary of your people was never really limited to your immediate camp. It stretched out across an entire regional network, connected by marriage, by shared ceremonies, by trade, by seasonal gatherings where multiple bands would come together, feast, trade stories, and yes, arrange marriages. Genetically speaking, functionally, the real breeding population wasn't 25 people. It was thousands, loosely connected across a landscape, occasionally converging and then dispersing again. There's actually a term anthropologists use for this: the 500 rule. A rough estimate suggesting that a population needs roughly 500 individuals in its breeding network to avoid the worst effects of genetic drift and inbreeding depression over the long term. And what's remarkable is that hunter-gatherer social structures across wildly different continents and cultures tend to naturally cluster right around that number when you count the full extended network of connected bands. Which raises a genuinely eerie question. Did ancient humans somehow intuit the correct minimum viable population size for genetic health purely through cultural trial and error, thousands of years before anyone could calculate it mathematically? Or is it that groups who happened to organize themselves around roughly that scale simply survived better, and so that pattern got selected for, generation after generation, until it became the default template for human society? Either way, the numbers line up in a way that feels almost too tidy to be coincidence. Now, of course, none of this means ancient humans were flawless about it. Inbreeding absolutely happened throughout history, and in some cases it happened deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with genetic health and everything to do with keeping power, wealth, or bloodlines pure in a very different sense. Ancient Egyptian royalty is probably the most famous example, with pharaohs like Tutankhamun descending from generations of sibling and close cousin marriages within the royal family, a practice motivated by the belief that the royal bloodline was divine and shouldn't be diluted by outsiders. Genetic analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy, published by researchers who sequenced his DNA, found strong evidence of significant inbreeding in his family tree, and his remains show a number of health issues, including a cleft palate, a club foot, and evidence of a bone disorder that many researchers link directly to that concentrated ancestry. The Habsburg royal family of Europe is another textbook case, and honestly, one of the most extreme. Centuries of strategic marriages between cousins and even uncles and nieces, all in the name of consolidating power across European thrones, eventually produced what's now known in medical literature as the Habsburg jaw, a pronounced jaw deformity that shows up again and again in Habsburg portraits across generations. The very last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, is often cited as the tragic endpoint of this strategy. A man plagued by severe physical and developmental disabilities, unable to produce an heir, whose death in 1700 triggered a war over succession precisely because centuries of keeping it in the family had genetically dead-ended the entire line. So it's not that royal families didn't know inbreeding could cause problems, it's that they were playing an entirely different game, prioritizing political power and bloodline purity over health outcomes, and paying the price for it in a way that ordinary hunter-gatherer and small-scale societies who had no throne to protect and no divine bloodline to maintain simply didn't need to. Which brings up an interesting irony. The very populations with the fewest resources, the least formal knowledge, and the most vulnerability to environmental pressure were often the ones with the most sophisticated systems for avoiding inbreeding, while the wealthiest, most powerful families in history, the ones who could have their pick of partners from anywhere, sometimes chose the exact opposite path and suffered spectacularly for it. So let's bring this back around. What actually was the answer to the question in the title? How did ancient humans avoid inbreeding? It wasn't one single trick. It was a layered stack of overlapping solutions built up over hundreds of thousands of years, some of it instinctive, some of it cultural, some of it almost accidental. It started with something as basic as an evolved psychological aversion to sexual attraction between people raised together from early childhood, a built-in safeguard that required no rules, no elders, no punishment, just biology quietly doing its job in the background. On top of that, human societies layered elaborate kinship systems, like the Australian subsection system or the Trobriand clan rules, essentially cultural algorithms that mapped out exactly who could marry whom, often with a level of mathematical precision that would make a modern statistician nod in respect. On top of that, entire populations organized themselves into regional networks, with women or men regularly moving between bands, walking hundreds of kilometers in some cases, specifically to keep those networks genetically connected. And running underneath all of it was the raw, brutal logic of natural selection itself. Groups that happened to land on effective anti-inbreeding customs simply survived better and out-reproduced groups that didn't, slowly seeding the entire species with cultural habits that protected its genetic future, whether anyone involved understood why or not. And when any part of that system broke down, when isolation became too extreme, when populations shrank too small, when royal families decided political convenience mattered more than genetic diversity, the consequences showed up exactly where you'd expect. In the bones, in the genomes, in the historical record, as a kind of permanent warning label written by evolution itself. There's something humbling about all this. We tend to imagine our ancient ancestors as barely scraping by, reacting to the world rather than shaping it, stumbling through survival on pure instinct. But the evidence tells a very different story. Somewhere in the deep past, without genetics, without written language in most cases, without any formal science to guide them, groups of humans figured out, through generations of careful observation and cultural transmission, one of the most important survival problems our species ever faced. They built systems to solve it. They enforced those systems with taboos, ceremonies, and social pressure. And they passed those systems down so faithfully that some of them, like Australian Aboriginal kinship structures, are still functioning today, tens of thousands of years later, doing exactly the job they were designed to do. Next time someone tells you that ancient humans were simple, unsophisticated, just barely getting by, you can tell them about the Neanderthals who were running exchange networks between valleys 50,000 years ago. You can tell them about Bronze Age women walking hundreds of kilometers to marry strangers for the sake of their future grandchildren's health. You can tell them about entire kinship systems mapped out with the precision of a genetic algorithm built by people who never once heard the word chromosome. They didn't need the word, they just needed to survive long enough for us to be here, wondering how they did it.